Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. Today we have a very special guest, Professor David Elcott. Welcome to Arash's World.
Wonderful being here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Can you start off describing yourself? How would you describe yourself here briefly? And that's the toughest question. I promise the other questions will be easier as we go on.
You know, probably, and this probably says enormous amount about the work that I've done in my life, is two features. One is that I always felt myself an outsider. I grew up in kind of rural California, the child of immigrants. It was after the immigration that came from the Appalachians and from the Midwest to California. So around me, basically, people were very white and blonde and Christian. The guys were nice and tall and they could throw a spiral football, and I was short and dark. And Jewish, and my family was an immigrant family, and I wrote poetry instead of throwing a football. So you can imagine what my childhood, was like, feeling myself other in that context. The other thing I would say about myself is that I therefore always felt the need to change, and I became very interested in how change occurs psychologically, and then its impact on society, on political sphere, on the economic sphere. And I think those two features are dominating: feeling other. And therefore, when you feel other, you have two options. One is you close yourself off and you isolate yourself. The other is you have to be very good at culturally understanding what's happening around you so that you can navigate it better, because you don't quite belong. And I think I was on that side. So I had to develop a sensitive eye to what was going on around me. And then I was very interested in change. So all of my work from the very beginning, my very first research was done in Syria. And it was how people born as a shopkeeper Muslim in Aleppo, or as a Druze in the mountains, or as a Shiite Alawi in Latakia, how you became a citizen of Syria after you never saw yourself that way. You saw yourself as part of the Turkish Empire or part of colonial France. And it went from there consistently to, the day that the Soviet Union fell. If you were a civics teacher, what did you teach the next day in class? Did you teach Tsarist, Soviet? What could you do? So I became interested in that, and then came to the realization that none of us are living in the world into which we were born. We are all living in a world that is, best expressed by rapid change, unexpected, ambiguous, ambivalent. You don't quite know what's going to happen, and therefore you have to learn to maneuver in very different ways. So that's really a funny way to talk about myself, but it directs where I went intellectually, professionally, in terms of my research and my teaching and consulting.
It's brilliant, because you just, that was my life story there. I can completely relate to everything. Just replace football with soccer and we're there, because
it wasn't my place. It wasn't my place to say that, but I imagine that you too, if you're living in Canada, you were born in Iran, you traveled to get there. Similarly, a similar story. And I think it is a more universal story than we imagine. Even those who are living within their own country, who have been living for generations, can still feel alienated, can still feel unmoored by all the changes taking place. And I think that we have not come to grips with the emotional, spiritual, psychological, and therefore political and economic impact of that.
I'd like to get into that, but just for me personally, the idea of patriotism does not make a lot of sense, because there is not one country I would identify with. I mean, of course, I'm a Canadian and I love Canadian culture, but there's other cultures I enjoy too. For me, it's like food. Why limit yourself to one type of food and accept all of them? So that's why that part, I feel like I'm kind of rootless and homeless, which has both benefits as well as drawbacks. On the other side, also in terms of religion, I find myself identify with pretty much all of them, but I cannot commit to one. And that's why I like the idea of interfaith. That's something that I've been very fascinated with.
Well, I'm not going to ask if you're married, because obviously that would, good.
Yeah.
So at least there's some areas you're willing to commit.
Oh, yes.
And to root yourself. Let me say though, let me respond to what you're saying to understand this. In the United States, about half the population does not have a passport. Unlike you, they can't imagine these other worlds. It's not that you're unrooted, it's that you're a global citizen. We could drop you anywhere and you'd find your way. You'd find a way to be comfortable in that culture. You'd find your place. You'd find connection with other people, and you'd be interested in other people and other cultures. It doesn't scare you.
But I feel kind of like Zelig in Woody Allen's film, where you just adapt to them, but where's your own identity? And it's like mixes of different parts. But global citizen I like.
But I'm going to push back on this, and I'd say you're much more grounded than you imagine, but you're grounded in this global world. And the problem for us is that for many other people, they see you as a threat, because they look at you and they say, wait a moment, what are you doing in my country? You're not authentically Canadian. I'm not authentically American. When I was a little kid, we have a song in America, My Country 'Tis of Thee. It was the American version of the God Save the King. So we had to have different words once we were independent. And it said, my country 'tis of thee, land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died. And I remember being a little kid and saying to myself, wait, my fathers didn't die here. Nobody in my family died here. We're all, my family's from Europe. My family came to this country. And I remember being really conscious, wow, that's not me. But for those people who don't have a passport, who look at you or look at me and say, but what do you mean all religions? I'm a Christian in America, or I'm a Muslim in Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, or I'm a Hindu in India, or I'm Jewish, I'm a Jew in Israel. You're complicating things for me. You're taking away the clarity of my culture, of my identity. And I'm going to resist you. I'm going to fight against you.
That's definitely true. And so let's talk about your book, Faith, Nationalism, and the Future of Liberal Democracy. And so it couldn't be more timely. I mean, this is exactly what we're going through. I myself like to shy away from politics, but really after Trump got elected, I felt that one has to take a stand. Well, you can't stay away. And everything, as like I think Michel Foucault says, everything is political. And even if you don't take a stand, that is also political. So it's quite complicated. But let's talk about your book.
Sure. So all the things that we've been talking about already is part of what motivated the book. In particular, once you reach adulthood, there are very few places where you come together with many other people with a similar interest. Granted, it could be a football game, or it could be a hockey game or a baseball game. And you feel allegiance to your team. And when other people are up cheering, you're up cheering as well. But I wouldn't qualify that as kind of an intellectual, spiritual, or even political engagement. Although we do know in Europe, soccer fans can get quite violent. But the only places where people come together in meaningful ways is in church, obviously mosque, temple, synagogue, but in a religious setting. And even though fewer people are going regularly to church than before, your identity, and I'm not talking about religious observance, your identity is grounded in a culture that includes what religion is. So for example, in the Scandinavian flags, the Swiss flags, what's the flag? What does it look like?
The Swiss one, or the
Swiss, or the Swedish, or the Norwegian, or the Danish? They all have the same.
They have a cross.
They have a cross.
Yeah.
And you say to yourself, on one hand, who cares? They don't even think of the cross in terms of it being a statement about Christianity. On the other hand, we know that that cross conquered the world, that colonial forces would march into Latin America or into Africa or into Asia with that cross, as the song went, onward Christian soldiers marching off to war with the cross of Jesus, right? So it's true that few people may go to church, and yet that symbol of identity is incredibly important. So if we're going to find a way to address the threats to liberal democracy, and I'll explain that in a second, then faith communities can be a wonderful resource. And so the book talks about faith communities developing a theology of democracy, that it's not enough to say we want to help refugees or we want to help the poor. We actually have to show that our faith, our religion, promotes the pluralism of a democratic system, which says, I believe what I believe it passionately, I'm committed to it, but I respect that there are alternatives. I respect that there are other views. So I think that's the framing of the book. The issue of democracy is, for me, more complicated. When we look at a Putin, or we look at an Orban in Hungary, or we look at Netanyahu in Israel, or Modi in India, and we say, well, they're undemocratic. And I would argue, no, that's not what they are. It's a different understanding of what democracy is. When you and I were little kids, let's say in preschool, and the teacher would say, who wants to go outside and who wants to play indoors? How would you make a decision? The kids would raise their hands. I want to go outside, or I want to see, and who wins? The majority. So there is an idea of majority rule, an idea that the majority knows what's best. Well,
that's something I've struggled with, because Hitler was democratically elected. And what if the majority is wrong?
Exactly. So liberal democracies that developed after World War II in particular said democracy means the rule of the majority with rights for minority. In other words, the majority cannot deny the rights of others living within their country. And that held because we believed that it was all the same, meaning the majority would never want to oppress the minority, even though we have a long history of knowing they did. But after World War II, after seeing the horrible destruction, right, who would say that we should attack minorities? And so we presumed that we could unify majority rule, minority rights, and kind of a shared culture where we can share our present and our future. And that lasted for a number of decades following the war, even to almost the turn of the century with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you had Francis Fukuyama calling for the end, saying, he wrote about the end of history, that liberal democracy, which is dependent on capitalist society, was not just triumphant, it was the only way history will unfold. And from the time he wrote that, it's been downhill ever since. We did not expect this, but what happened was we began splitting. Some called for majority rule and said, that's all we need to know. Others said, no, we are all about minority rights. So the right of trans, in the United States, for example, the right of trans children, which represents a fraction of the population, becomes the most important thing for those who are supporting trans rights. And it's not that I don't support trans rights, but the overwhelming majority is saying, wait a moment, like a guy is a guy, a girl is a girl, you're mixing us all up. Or I'm a Muslim, I have the right to practice, not only to practice, but I have a right to wear a hijab if I'm a woman. I have a right to live by the customs of my culture. And what happened in France, although Marine Le Pen was not elected, but almost 42% of the population, the voters, supported her. And they said, wait a moment, if you're in France, you better live by French culture. You have no right to come here and think you can impose your Muslim culture on us, right? So we had a pushback there, and suddenly the very notion of democracy itself is under attack. And so the book both tries to present the tensions about democracy, it tries to honor the concerns of those who feel themselves terribly threatened by the globalism that you and I, in which you and I feel comfortable, and yet will come around to say, wait a moment, we can't really live this way. We can't really live with the oppression of minorities. We can't live with the attacks on those who are in our minds not authentic enough to be real citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like, it seems like what it is, it's not so much democracy versus autocracy. It's more like, there are certain rules in the guidebook that you need to follow. So when you're playing a game, you both agree, these are the rules and I will not do that. And what we're leading towards is it's anarchy. And it's not really politically lined either way. I think it can be both sides. And what makes it more complicated is that we have the idea of freedom of speech and censorship. And it could be taken by both sides on either side of the political spectrum. And it becomes more complicated because those who are talking about freedom of speech are the ones who are curtailing it at the same time and taking it away. So it seems like we're in an Orwellian world where with doublespeak and different meanings and so on. But I think I remember a scene in the Grand Illusion by Jean Renoir, where they're saying this is the last gentleman's war. And right now, like it's just chaos, anarchy. And I'm actually, I'm scared of that. I find that frightening.
You have good reason to be scared. So if I say, wait, you need to protect my right to be Jewish, even though that's under 2% of the population, mm-hmm. You have to respect my right to be Jewish, mm-hmm. And you have to allow whatever. And then wait, I'm Sikh, or I'm Buddhist, or I'm Hindu, or I'm Muslim, right? You have to respect my rights, or I'm trans, or I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, right? Or I'm Black, or I'm, right? It's not a surprise at some point that the white plurality in America will say, wait a moment, okay, you have to protect my rights too, because my rights feel threatened as well. And we, in some ways, created a culture in which victimhood became valued. The more I can claim victimhood. So I have to say, for example, with my students, if I try to talk about poor whites, there's a book called White Trash that claims there's been this underclass where my students rebel. They say, why? Because you can take a white trash, wash his face, put on a suit and tie, and he can go anywhere. And if I'm Black, or I'm Latino, or I'm gay, right, I can't. But that's not true. We know that because we have many, many generations of white trash that can't seem to get out of their circumstances. I'm not saying, I don't want to compare victimhood. I'm only saying it's not a surprise that you're having rebellion, mm-hmm. from that crowd. And by the way, I have to tell you, I've been dealing with a lot of people from Saskatchewan. Oh. And guess what? They talk the same way. Right? Mm-hmm. They think the coast of Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, why are they making these demands on multiculturalism? We're good Midwesterners, we're farmer, why? We know who we are. So and of course it's the same in India, and it's the same in Jerusalem, and it's the same in Indonesia, and it's the same in Myanmar. Right? We know who we are. We're the majority. We have our rights. This is our culture. We need to protect our culture.
And absolutely true. And I think we really need to listen without prejudice, without stereotype threats. I mean, when you see a white person, there's that stereotype threat that says, okay, well, potentially racist or privileged and so on. Whereas the Black person also has to deal with it, and people from other ethnic groups. And so I think it's like you cannot have a free and a relaxed conversation without that being in the background of your mind, especially because the media is constantly talking about that. That's really in the foreground. And I think what's happening too, and we talked about identity, people want to identify with something that makes them feel good, but then it goes to more and more extremist parts, so we have more polarization. Because in order to appear not racist, you try to take an extreme position, and others, in order to protect their culture, as you're saying, they go the other way. And that's why we have movements from the far right and the far left. And I just say, let's find a common ground there, because there are lots of things that people have in common.
Well, look, I'll push back a little bit. And fundamentally, I agree. I've spent a lot of my life trying to build bridges. A lot of my research was in right-wing, evangelical, Christian, born again, communities in the rural South, in very conservative Catholic churches. So it's not that I don't see this, but I want to push back a little bit on this. If we're going to make it in the world and increasingly homogenized, in a sense, our countries are looking less and less like, well, I know exactly what a Swede looks like. I know exactly, right? That we've got to find ways to accommodate a more pluralist culture. We have to find a way. And that's not the problem of the left. The left is already there. They believe in that.
Sure.
It is the problem of the right. And the difference, let me tell you that the difference, whether it's in India with Hindutva, which is the ideology of Hindu triumphalism, or whether it's within the Islamic world, the sense that ultimately the world will be Muslim, and in our world, in Canada and the United States, these countries were founded by pilgrims, by Christian refugees looking for a home for their Christianity. And that Christianity became, when you read, for example, let's use the United States, when you look at the Mayflower Compact, when you look at the early speeches, they talk about America being the new Israel. They talk about America being divinely sanctioned, right? And yes, it will allow for diversity because there were diverse Christian groups, but fundamentally, the names of cities are all biblical names, right? And the belief was that we in America, this is the new Israel that is covenantally blessed by God. And that covenant means that we need to keep this country pure. And now let me respond to what about purity? Well, two men making love with each other, that is an impurity. Now, maybe I can accept what they do privately in their bedroom, but now you want the state to sanction, to sacralize, right? To make gay marriage almost like a secular sacrament, right, of the United States, that the role of women and the role of men, which is very clearly defined in our culture, is now going to be messed up, and men acting as women and women acting as men, and promiscuous sex and giving out condom. All of this is an impurity. It actually is undermining God's grace. It's undermining God's promise of protecting us because we are covenantally committed to the purity of the nation. So ironically, corruption isn't about political corruption or lying, right? About taking money. Corruption is about undermining the integrity of America, the godliness of America, which means God will evaporate. God will leave this country and this country will be damned. That explains a really interesting phenomenon for us. In the Bible, listen carefully to this. In the Bible, the glorious king is King David. King David was an adulterer. King David was a murderer. King David was a blasphemer. King David did all of these horrible things. But according to the tradition, the Messiah descends from King David, from all that impurity. Now think about Donald Trump, right? All those impurities in Donald Trump. And yet he could be messianic because he's trying to bring back God's grace to America, right? It's an ironic, you say to yourself, how could conservative evangelicals support somebody? If my kid came home and said, oh, I just, I won't use the language to talk about a woman's anatomy, and then I just had sex with her. If I were the father of my 16 or 17-year-old, what would I do? I'd lock him up, right? I'd punish him. But he said, but I'm just being like the president, right? So there's this strange sense of purity on one hand, and yet accepting a Donald Trump as a messianic figure. And that's why this adulation of Donald Trump seems so strange. And we could say of a Putin or of a Netanyahu, of a Modi, and it's around the world. We see this adulation of these more authoritarian figures because we believe that somehow they will bring back the glory of our nation.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it puts things really into perspective. But for me, I'm fascinated by Jesus Christ. And if you look at, and that's a common denominator across various religions. And if we can really look at what he's saying and understand what he's saying, and he's hanging out with prostitutes and children and lepers and so on. So he's not that authority, that king that comes in majestically. He comes on a donkey into the city, and he's a rebel. And he is, for me, is in my view, how I see it, is a Marxist in many ways as well, because of his acceptance of everyone. And I think that's it. I mean, freedom, if you want to live your life that way, that's fine. When we talk about freedom, but then we say, no, you can't do this, then we're taking away their freedom. However, there's a caveat there, I think, when it comes to censorship. And there are certain things that I think it's just so bizarre, deniers of climate change and even worse, Holocaust deniers, that I think you have to be also responsible, because your freedom comes with responsibility, individual and social responsibility of what you're saying. To say that the Sandy Hook massacre was staged is just horrendous. I mean, there is, you shouldn't be able to say that. It's
wait. So who's going to censor? Who's going to make the decision?
That is difficult. Yes, one oneself, I think, our own individual that accord, the gentleman's accord or gentlewoman's accord of saying, okay, I will be responsible.
Yeah, that's over. So now what are you going to do?
No, I guess we have to, and that's the danger there, because then you might be led towards authoritarian figures to instill that rule of law. And
no, we're there.
Yeah,
that's what's happening. Now what are you going to do? Well, Twitter may be shortly owned by Elon Musk as a private purchase. Mm-hmm. So I guess he can make the decisions on what's going to be true or false. Mm-hmm. And Facebook can make the decisions of what's going to be true and false.
Then as a Christian and a various religion, what would Jesus Christ do and be led by that?
Well, yeah, but Jesus Christ also overturned the tables in the temple and threw out the moneylenders. He said that he wasn't only, did you see the movie, the Passion of the Christ?
Yes.
So you remember that last scene? The last scene was Jesus rising, a triumphant martial arts, ready to battle Jesus coming out.
Okay.
So I appreciate your read of Jesus, but not everybody reads Jesus that way.
Yeah.
Right? Not everybody reads Moses that way. Not everybody reads Buddha. Think about that. Siddhartha Buddha, right, was all believing in peace and in loving, right? And yet look at what's happening in Myanmar. As the Buddhists are genocidally attacking Rohingya and fighting now ethnic groups throughout the country in a most dictatorial, vicious fashion. So what we're finding is, that's why I'll go back to how I began by saying, I'm calling for religious leaders to create theologies of democracy in the authentic language of their own tradition. So I can give you an explanation of what that is. When we think about idolatry in the Bible is not about a physical form. That's easy. Idolatry is saying that I know God. I know God. I know God's will. That's idolatry. That's heresy within, for example, Jewish tradition. That's heresy to say that. Because it's saying that I am therefore God, because I know God. So therefore, all I can say is I know pieces and I honor those pieces. I believe those pieces. I'll live my life on those pieces. But I have to accept that others may have other pieces of God's will, of God's presence, of God's word that I don't have. And I think that every religious group needs to be able to develop that. And it's not crazy. Christianity has historically been able to have a modesty. Islam has been able to have a modesty. There's a real concern about claiming absolute knowledge of God. Mm-hmm. So I would say the antidote isn't to try to say, well, Jesus is really this, but rather to say there may be many Jesus, but or maybe to say it differently, if I hear that God says that I should murder others in the name of God, that I should wipe out other civilizations in the name of God, don't give up on God, give up on those who say that and create an alternative. And right now, right-wing religion sounds more authentic than democratic voices in religion. And that's why I think we have to work hard to be able to show how fundamental modest belief is and democratic acceptance of others within our society is.
And also not falling into the trap of conformity. So you have this view, so the American view or the evangelical view of Christianity, and everybody kind of follows it without standing up, without questioning it. And that's something so that's what I like about Jesus, where he's a rebel and he turns over those tables. I would do that too, because it's like, wait, this is not right. I mean, you say it's right, but it doesn't mean it makes it right. And I have my own way of seeing things, and that should be respected as well. But because it's working like a cult, that's being suppressed, and people are afraid of even though they disagree with it, they're afraid of speaking up because they will get punished for doing so.
Well, let me ask a question. Mm-hmm. So if you're all right with Jesus overturning tables,
yeah,
how are you about blocking an abortion clinic or trying to invade an abortion clinic and overturn the desks and the equipment and the operating table?
It depends on the cause, though. I mean, that's not the same.
Why not? You're saving lives.
Well, yeah.
So I'm pushing back a bit to say I don't want to make this easy. This is incredibly, incredibly complicated. I think it is possible to oppose abortion, but you have to do it within the democratic system, which means you have to convince enough people of the truth of your view. And if you eventually finally do that, then I may have to accept, I'll find alternatives, but I may have to accept.
It's being judgmental, and I'm not that. It's only when I see things like taken away, that's when I take judgment. When people take away people's rights or people are racist against that, that's when I will stand up. But if you want to live your own life anyhow you like,
you don't believe,
I'm okay with that.
But you don't believe that. For example, you said people shouldn't be allowed to promote falsehoods that actually are dangerous by saying that COVID isn't really a disease. Don't get vaccinated. You would oppose that.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not as accepting as you make yourself sound.
That's true.
I'm I'm all for the complexity. Democracies are messy.
Exactly.
Democracies are complicated. Democracies, managing them is incredibly difficult. We are seeing the deep disappointments in democracy, the feelings that liberal democracy is failing us. We're seeing that all over. I think that liberal democracies have not addressed the fears that people have of loss, the fears that they have that their world is turning upside down. I think it's complicated. And I would only say you, as you are in the work that you're doing, you are a voice in this conversation. But you're also judgmental as to whose voice should be heard and what you should really be saying. So the only alternative I can come up with is a robust, free, open dialogues.
Exactly.
And yes, and that's the reason why I'm saying, in some sense, the right is more dangerous than the left. The left is doing messy stuff, like trying to stop somebody from speaking at the university, attacking professors who don't say what you want. I get that. But the right is doing something else. The right is actually undermining the very institutions of democracy. They are when Trump said that the press is the enemy of the people, that was actually the language of Hitler. That was the language of Goebbels in Germany. When the president tries to use the Justice Department to vindictively assault his enemies, that's now they've now released the papers from Nixon, who did that. And of course, we know that Trump did that. When you use the power of the federal government to attack the governors and citizens of states, enforcing them, of depriving them, of their rights, that's different than demonstrating against a speaker. That's actually undermining the very institutions of democracy. And we are only as strong as our institutions. Individuals can say what they want, but when the institutions themselves are damaged, and that goes to our courts as well, because under President Trump, he demonized our courts. And now
the Constitution to an extent.
So for now, for the first time, the Supreme Court of the United States is viewed as fair by under 50% of the American population. That is a serious diminution of kind of civility and of a sense of democratic process. If I can't trust the Supreme Court to address in a fair constitutional method, address the central issues of our country, that is a deep, deep threat to me. And I think that we're looking, I think a Republican victory, where the way the Republican Party is now in America, a Republican victory, just like, the victory of in France of Marine Le Pen, or the victory of Orban in Hungary. I mean, I think these are endangering us because they're assaults on the very institutions of the country. And that's different. So the right and the left, we may see them as similar in terms of their critiques, but they're not similar in terms of their behavior.
And we should all agree on democracy and liberal democracy and that point. And that should be agreement, and respecting both sides should respect it. I found out something very interesting just recently about the Constitution, that the founding fathers might have been influenced by Indian tribes, because their structure of the government, the federal government and the states, was something that they had with 5 nations. And some of these ideas of liberty and the freedom, equality, and so on might have been influenced by them, because this was before the French Revolution. So it's kind of a ripple effect, and that is fascinating. And it gives a very pluralistic view of things, that the natives might have influenced the Constitution and the French Revolution and the rest of the world.
Look, I'm all for accepting myth making, and my guess is that when you read John Locke, when you read David Hume, when you read the British versus the continental political philosophers, you see pretty much that the founders, Madison, Jefferson, Franklin, they were more likely directly influenced by the limitations that these thinkers saw on government. In general, you talked about the French Revolution, but the French Revolution was driven more by Rousseau's notion of the general will, of collective will, of the majority rule. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the case in England, in the revolutions in England. In England, it was different. It was the limitations put on government and the kind of deconstruction of the central authority of a king who had absolute power and control. So it may be there's a parallel there. Maybe they knew something and they liked it, but clearly the founders of American democracy went on the presumption that local government, state government is actually more, it's closer to the people and the needs of the people and their constituency than the federal government can be, and the federal government can be more limited. Now, as somebody who supported aggressive federal action on issues like civil rights, human rights, given the system now, given the courts now, I've actually become a states' rightist. I may have to accept that being locked up in Mississippi is a horrendous perversion of justice. It is discriminatory against the poor, against minorities. But I can talk about justice reform in New York. I think undermining the rights of women in Tennessee and undermining their rights to protect their own bodies is horrible, but because I can't stop that, I need to make sure that in New Jersey or Connecticut, women have protected rights. I think being gay in Alabama, they just passed, this terrible legislation there telling parents what they can or can't do with their own children, bringing up their children. I can't change that, but I can make sure that the rights of LGBTQ kids in California and Oregon are protected. And we may have to accept that we can do everything we can to try to change what happens in those states. But we also may have to accept that at least we need to protect and create positive models in the places that we can. It's a weird world. I never expected that as a progressive, I would be a states' rights activist, but that's where I am now.
Exactly. Yeah. I think one of the misconceptions is also reason. And when we talk about the age of reason and enlightenment and so on, there's this optimistic view that we are reasonable beings, and we're not. I mean, I just finished The Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. And there's this aggression that is often not addressed. And it's a part of human nature, I think, that we do have that aggression, but we can channel it towards good, towards things that are beneficial for humanity, but it's often not acknowledged. And so when an act of violence happens, we blame the person, but it's like, it's part of human nature. And I think we have to take that into consideration when we're coming up with plans and for improvement. But it's complicated. It's complex.
I mean, we have a long history that says human nature can be curtailed. It can be domesticated, so to speak. You may have read recently this very strange work by Tucker Carlson about masculinity, with lots of false evidence about male fertility and masculine fragility as a result of policies. Look, we have millennia of ways to try to create a healthier, more loving, nurturing society. I think you're right about human nature. We're made to defend ourselves and defend our families. Infants at a very early age can distinguish an angry face, right? So I understand that. And why do we put our right hand out to shake hands? Where's that custom from? It comes from
No
Europe.
weapons. No
Yeah,
weapons.
because
Yeah.
on the presumption that I'm right-handed.
Yeah.
Of course, if I'm left-handed, you're a dead man because I can pull out my left hand, right? So clearly we've tried to, so to speak, civilize ourselves. So I'm not prepared to buy we're basically vicious animals. I think we've come a long way. And my experience in talking to those with whom I really, really disagree politically is these are not evil people. They are people who I believe are misguided politically, but they're trying to work out their lives as well. And we have to find ways to be able to talk to each other. I've preached in very right-wing churches around the country. You know, here I'm a Jewish boy coming from New York University, a progressive university, but I can say something to them. I can say, I read the Bible in the original. Oh, that's very exciting. And then I can show them texts to make the points that I want to make about democracy and about pluralism. And I don't find people reacting with hostility. I find them reacting with interest and openness. So as much as I think we are in a very fraught period, that the future of civilization is in balance, I also fundamentally believe in the goodness of people.
I completely agree. I'm an optimist, and I think the really good things could come out of this. I found an interesting study where they looked at being polite in the northern versus southern states. And so southern states score much higher in being polite, but they're also more aggressive, whereas northern states are like rude, but they're not as aggressive. So the idea of honor becomes important, a culture of honor, which is more pronounced in the South than in the North. And so that's where you see the aggression. So by being polite, it doesn't mean that you don't have aggression. I think that's the acknowledgement we need to make. And once we do that, we see ourselves more as human, and it's complex. Nobody's entirely good or entirely bad. And I see there are right-wing people who are inherently good, but it's just like, you know, to connect with that, to find a way of tapping into that. And I think that is, again, the common denominator. We want the same thing with different religions. That's why I like interfaith. It's like, let's agree upon this point and find a consensus.
So let me go back to something you said early on. I assume, you know, as we move to wrap this up, let me go back to something you said early on. I want to distinguish between being a patriot and being a nationalist, right? Being a nationalist presumes something higher in my nation, something God-given, something that allows me to say my nation is not only superior, but my nation defines me. Nationalism promotes me to battle others, to belittle others. But patriotism can be a very positive thing.
Oh, sure.
Patriotism, well, you said in the beginning you weren't a patriot. But I want to make a claim. Then you said, but I'm Canadian, and I love being Canadian. And I want to make that point, that I do not believe that being democratic means you can't be a patriot. But in the same way that I can say, I think my mother is the best mother in the world, that doesn't mean that you can't say the same thing, and that I can honor your saying that in the context. I don't know your mother, you know your mother, right? So it's the same thing. I can love my nation and I can honor my nation and be grateful and say it's the best nation for me. At the same time, I have to respect and honor others saying the same thing. And that's the difference between patriotism and nationalism. We are in a period of nationalist revival that is scary. And I wish we could promote democratic patriotism rather than populist nationalism.
Absolutely. But one thing that bothers me is when people talk about, I'm proud of my nation, and I understand it, but being proud means you've done something, you know, you did something, and just being born in a specific place does not automatically make you deserving of that. I mean, I understand. I love, and I think love is really the word here. But I have an issue with pride, and that's again a more personal thing. Pride is what I can do, what's in my hands, what I'm doing. I'm proud of my podcast.
Vancouver Canucks. Is that the team?
Yeah, I'm not proud of them.
Well, but a lot of people are.
Yeah.
A lot of people have vicarious pleasure and joy in them, right? They feel amplified in their lives when they're successful.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know that that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing when you start smashing people from the other side in the head, or when you start screaming racist or homophobic epithets at the people on the other side. But I think it's all right. There is a piece of us that does want to be part of a team. Jonathan Haidt talks about team building that way. You can be, as an individual, you're competitive with others, but if you're on a rowing team, you're part of a team. As he says, you're literally in the same boat, and you want your team to win. So I think I'm all right with the idea of team patriotism, of national patriotism, as long as it's grounded in the principles of democracy. And that means that if we're playing a game and my team loses, I respect the game. I respect the terms of the game.
Yes.
And if I instead try to cheat in the game, I try to move the goal line, I try to handicap the other side, I throw a spitball, that's once you start cheating in the democratic game so that you can win no matter what, then it's no longer democracy. And I think what we've been seeing around the world is people doing exactly that. Certainly, the best example is Trump's not accepting his defeat and looking all the different ways that he looked to undermine the game. So James Carse wrote a book about game theory that way, and he said democracy, liberal democracy, is an infinite game. The goal is not to win the goal is not to win permanently, it's to win one game. But the moment you win the game, you go to play the next game. And you adhere to the rules, you follow the rules. So my team wins this time, it loses next time. My political party wins this time, it loses next time, but I'll continue to play. He claims there are finite games, and those games attempt to not only defeat the other side, but to end the game. And that's what dictatorships do. That's what authoritarian systems do. They want to end the game. And I think that Trump is a prime example of that. Putin is a prime example of that, willing to break the rules of the game so as to ensure a permanent victory. And it's against that we need to fight with everything we have to keep the game going.
Yes, and at that point it's game over, but we haven't reached that yet, and we want to make sure we fight for it. Thank you so much, Professor David Elcott. It's been such a pleasure, so stimulating, thought-provoking. Thank you so much for being here. And so you're the top professor of practice in public service and leadership at the Wagner School at NYU. And your book is entitled again, Faith, Nationalism, and the Future of Liberal Democracy. Thank you so much for spending time with us here.
Wonderful being with you. Keep going.
Thank you.